Greetings, I'm John, John Vidal, Guardian newspaper, sort of up the road in King's Cross now. This is my first time here. I've meant to have been here several times before. Deeply regret I haven't been. So welcome to me, welcome to all of you. This is, I think, today is an amazing day. This is the day when BP has, it thinks, capped its well after 4 months or whatever we've had of unbelievable pollution and desecration of ocean and other environments. They think they have succeeded, and they've put this cap on it, which means that they can at least collect it, even if we won't know for another day or so if it's officially the day when the crisis is over. But at least today is a very, very significant day. So it's a sort of tremendous coincidence that we have 4 people from the oil industry and the oil watching industry who have come here to chat about what went wrong, why this thing happened, where it goes from now, whether it's going to happen again, what are the risks, is oil the future anyway, is it the end of oil, or where have we got to now? So it's a fantastic chance for us all to sort of kind of sum up a whole lot of events which have happened. Now, some people have got to go sort of because of the global events, the BBC and various other people, the Guardian, are sort of trying to get interviews with all these different people. So you get to ask the questions first, and we'll talk for a few minutes, for a bit of time, then we'll throw it out to you, and then we'll have a grand old Barney debate, and you can throw anything you like at these guys. They'll take it. They're all worked for BP in one way or another before. Sorry, I haven't either. And all with one accord began to make excuse. Anyway, or if not Shell, and we'll just see how it goes. So thank you all for coming. What we'll do now is we'll ask each person just to kind of introduce themselves and say what they think has happened, what the significance is, and where we go from here. But it's basically, let's just get the take on today. And first of all, I'm going to introduce right from the man who probably knows more about oil spill pollution, who's Simon Boxall, who is a lecturer in oceanography at Southampton University, National Oceanography Centre, and the best tie in the building, who's been involved with oil spill monitoring and impact on a number of major European spills, including Brer, Sea Empress, Prestige, and Erica. Which one was Erica?
Erica was the French coast, the nasty thick stuff that sort of
we don't
stuck.
like that.
We don't like that.
Okay, so says the Simon, and then we have Richard, who is now Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Chemistry, but used to work for BP for over 25 years, and can, I think, talk for fairly authoritatively on what has been going wrong. Ben, who works with Platform. Platform are a sort of arts oil watching group which does amazing research on everything from what's going on in the Niger Delta to oil spills and oil pipelines and things like that. I think it did a very successful operation looking at BP and art sponsorship by the Tate and many other of our great artistic institutions last week. And Chris Kowalski, you may know as the man who, what I call Mr. Peak Oil, the man who has done more research into, if you like, the end of oil, or the end of oil as we know it, and has done the sort of but actually has got a sort of enormous sort of hinterland of experience within the oil industry and can talk endlessly for the. I'm prepared to be here until 4 o'clock in the morning because these guys are really interesting. So take it away. What has been going on? Why is today significant?
Why today's significant because they've at long last apparently capped the oil. I think BP have been very cautious after various disasters, mishaps in terms of their ability to stop the oil flowing. They've sort of been very cautious about announcing great successes, and I think that very quietly they've slipped this under the line, saying, well, actually, we think we've done it this time. It looks like they have, at long last, capped the oil for the moment. It's a temporary cap. It isn't to replace the bypass well that they're drilling, which will be the permanent fix. So what it means is that we are in a situation, hopefully, where we can now start to look at the amount of oil that's been spilt, and we can start to deal with the consequence of that oil. Is it a disaster? Is it a catastrophe? 11 people died in the initial incident, 2 people have died since, so 13 people have lost their lives as a result of this accident. In that sense, it's a catastrophe. For the families, for the friends of those people who've died, it's a catastrophe. Is it a catastrophe in terms of environmental damage? It's in deep water. It's a mile deep, and that's part of the problem. It's also 50 miles off the coast, so the impact of this oil spill isn't on the same scale as some of the major spills such as Exxon Valdez or indeed Sea Impress. The impact on the beaches on the coastlines, having seen firsthand what an oil spill looks like, is nothing like the oil spills we've seen in Europe, oil spills we've seen in Africa, oil spills we've seen in other parts of the world. There is oil contamination. There are problems. This is not a minor incident, this is a major incident. But one has to put it into perspective in terms of its environmental impact. And I would suspect that maybe a year down the line, the memory of what's happened over the last few months will be very, very faint in most people's mind and also in most politicians' mind. We'll see.
Very good. I did some very rough calculations this afternoon on what percentage of oil this represented, this leak represented, or this spill represented, of American oil production. And in terms of hours over a year, this represented less than 4 hours worth of oil, of the oil which is consumed by America in a year. So in one level, it is very, very little. But Chris, from your perspective, what do you make of what's happened?
Well, I think we'll draw back a step and say, well, why were the companies rushing to develop deeper and deeper oil? The short answer is they've nowhere else to go. This is the most attractive place for the big companies to go. We know that volumes going forward are very challenged. We know that OPEC controls most of the reserves. And so that the big oil is chasing two things. It's been chasing the tar sands and it's been chasing deep water oil. Now, the nature of deep water oil is that it's actually been developed surprisingly quickly. From the days when we were developing the North Sea, where the deepest you can get is about 1,000 feet, we've now got wells in 8,000 feet, producing in 8,000 feet, and we've drilled, in 10, even 12,000 feet of water. So huge, huge technical push out. But I think there's a real sense in which the ability to do the drilling, even the ability to do the production, has run ahead of knowing what to do when things go wrong. And we've more or less seen this in this incident, where the initial attempts were really heroic lash-ups. And it's only now that we're getting towards, if you like, more serious engineering, where we're really starting to come to grips with it. So I think that is the background we're working against. In addition, this, apart from the sheer stupidity of naming an oil field after a doomed village in a rather intellectual book, the thing that happened with this well, it was just one of those wells where everything went wrong. Now, the capacity to drill in very deep water is restricted because there's only a quite limited, sorry about this, a quite limited number of vessels or rigs that can do this. So they're very expensive. So BP was having to spend slightly over $500,000 a day on this rig, and the rig was about 40 days overdue. The well had been proved troublesome, so obviously everyone was screaming at everyone else, and there was enormous pressure on to get it finished off as quickly as possible. And what we see is that if you look at the sort of letter from the Congressional Committee to Haywood, it's a catalogue of shortcuts taken, albeit sanctioned by the American regulatory authorities, which should never have been taken. So in that sense, some of the oil companies saying, other oil companies saying they might not have done that, might even be correct. It was just one of those sort of accidents waiting to happen, and like all really good accidents, it wasn't one bad decision, it was a whole series of bad decisions coming together and producing the catastrophe that we've seen. And there's no way to to minimise the impact. It was, if you like, unfortunate coming at a time of recession in the US, unemployment, uncertainty and the rest of it, a relatively weak president seeking to stamp his authority, a UK chairman or CEO who didn't quite understand the American way of doing things. So it just was one of those nightmares where error after error was made on both sides, and it's sort of a hole that they were just digging deeper and deeper. Now, hopefully this is the beginning of the end. We will have to see. So I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, excellent. Richard, I mean, accident waiting to happen, or was this actually just a sort of massive, I mean, you know the industry, you know, BP, was this corruption, of intellectual corruption within BP, or was it the culture of the corporation, or could it actually have happened to any of these oil companies?
Well, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep. I guess those who know me will know that amongst my rather eclectic activities, I have run production on an offshore platform. So I've seen production, I've seen drilling, and it's very useful to figure out or to ask the question, what on earth was BP doing there in the first place? And what seems not to get into the public domain is that BP was actually just drilling an exploration well. And they found oil. The normal procedure for doing that is that you're drilling in anticipation of finding oil. You have a whole column of drilling mud all the way from the drilling vessel down to the bottom of the hole, and that drilling mud balances the pressure of any oil you might find. It also carries away the bits of rock that you drill, and it also lubricates the drilling bits. So that's the normal process. What happens then when you discover oil? You don't get a gusher because the mud is balancing it. And the only way you discover oil is by looking at the chips of rock that come up, and you see that there is hydrocarbon there. There is oil in the chips of rock. And that's really the principal way, beyond chemical analysis, to discover what's happening. So BP was going through that process, and incidentally, what will come out later is that it isn't BP, it's Halliburton and other contractors who are actually doing the work. But BP is drilling away like that. They found oil. Once you find oil in an exploration well, you then pump cement down the center of the drilling pipe to actually plug the well. All right, so you have a situation where the bottom of the well is plugged with cement several tens of feet. Plugged with cement, and they do that because you don't just produce a well once you've discovered it. You discover oil through a number of wells, and maybe 2 or 3 years later, you then bring all those wells on stream at the same time through production facilities. So BP was going through a standard procedure of plugging the well once it had found oil. It had then gone through the procedure, again a standard one, of pumping seawater down the middle of the drill pipe to displace the mud. So you had a situation where you had a well, cement, seawater, and on the top of that was the blowout preventer, which, if all else fails, severs the drill pipe to seal the well. Now, before they remove the blowout preventer, the idea is that you put in typically mechanical plugs at the top of the well. So you can imagine in an ideal situation you have the cement at the bottom, seawater all the way up to the seabed, then mechanical plugs. Once you've done that, you take away the blowout preventer and you just leave the well for several years while you drill around for more oil. So that's what should have happened. But what clearly did happen was that having filled the well with water, before they put in the mechanical plugs, before they pulled the BOP, the bottom cement plug must have failed. And so oil shot up, displaced the water. The guys on the drilling rig they pressed the buttons to trigger the blowout preventer, which would have sealed the well. It would sever the drill pipe would have fallen away. That well should have been sealed. But what I understand is that probably there was some distortion as this plug ruptured at the bottom. The blowout preventer didn't close, which is why you got oil spewing out. So that's what happened, we think. And then from now on, from that time onwards, it was a question of how you addressed it. ultimately you've heard that the valve has gone in. That valve, in a sense, has replaced what was effectively like a funnel that was collecting only some of the oil. The rest of the oil was going into the sea and causing the spill. That valve now provides the first time, and this is the significance, the first time that there is a continuous link between the well and the ships on the surface of the water. And the idea will be to slowly close that valve over the next few days, stop the flow, but at the same time, you've got relief wells being drilled, and in two weeks' time or so, those relief wells will inject a mass of concrete around the defective well. So the defective well will be sealed at the bottom, it will be sealed at the top with this valve, and then the idea is that plugs will be put in at the top, and then eventually the blowout preventer will be removed, and that well will be left for several years until and if it becomes economic to produce amongst a number of other wells that might be drilled within roughly a few square miles. So that is the mechanics of what's happening. And probably that's enough for me to say at this stage.
Stop there. Come in, Ben, because you come in from a very different sort of more political, environmentalist point of view. I mean, you've seen oil being extracted on the Niger Delta and elsewhere, where clearly there are different standards applying. I mean, this is perhaps what you would say. And I mean, I've been there myself. I've seen oil spills on a sort of massive scale, which are not recognised in the same way. I mean, what do you make of this? Is this just America going sort of berserk because it's very close to it, or is this a case of total double standards? What's happening to you?
Well, I think there's definitely elements of pretty shocking double standards which have been highlighted quite forcefully through the media of late, who suddenly have started paying attention to the sort of 50-year legacy of oil production in the Niger Delta of Nigeria. I think there are elements of appalling double standards in terms of the sheer sort of lack of resources and response in Nigeria in comparison to the sort of almost titanic response to Deepwater Horizon. It's also interesting in relation to what has been said about the potential environmental impact on the Gulf of Mexico. I think that sort of broadly speaking, what we're certainly learning from Deepwater Horizon is as much about BP's failure, negligence, and sort of fairly casual, carefree attitude towards safety and risk, which has led to some of the mechanical failures and the appalling environmental impact that's happening. But it's also something that is systemic within the oil industry. I think that the attitudes are simply not unique to BP. These are attitudes that are pretty widespread in an industry which is essentially driven by the bottom line, essentially, and which is cutting corners on safety left, right, and centre, and which is exposing risk not to itself and its contractors, but is exposing that risk to the environment and to the local communities affected by environmental disasters like Deepwater Horizon. And I think this whole question of who carries the risk is really important, and we'll probably be discussing that extensively. And in relation to Nigeria then, I mean, one can look at Nigeria, I guess, as the oil industry with its gloves off. You have in Nigeria, for a variety of reasons, through weak governance, a combination of corporate exploitation of complete lack of regulation, that has led in turn to essentially one of the world's most pristine and biodiverse rainforests being turned into one of the world's worst oil-impacted ecosystems. And essentially oil spills are a daily occurrence in the Niger Delta, and we'll probably sort of explore that a bit more later. But Nigeria can contain some pretty powerful lessons, I think, for other communities and governments. And I mean, one of the things that we've certainly noted in terms of the sort of political space around Deepwater Horizon is this wedge that's been driven in between Western governments in particular and the oil industry. We're hearing the EU Energy Commissioner urging EU states to enact a moratorium on deep water drilling in European territory, in the European waters, until the environmental risks, until the blowout preventer mechanisms are in place, and until there's adequate oversight and regulation. And so there's this potential, an interesting political space in which we're working and other groups are working to sort of maximize, I guess, the potential regulatory oversight that may result from Deepwater Horizon. But I'd also sort of add a cautionary twist to that, which is that I would characterize the oil industry as one which won't change by itself for a variety of reasons, partly because of its sort of entrenched and vested interests and the way in which governments and the oil industry have had a sort of traditionally quite a proximate and interlaced relationship. What we have to see is activism on many levels within governments, within the courtrooms, and also from civil society to ensure that lessons are actually learned. Because I'm not so convinced that without all of those things, that the industry will actually change. And I would sort of draw out one example, which is the shocking execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 of his colleagues. Ken Saro-Wiwa being the Nigerian activist and writer who was campaigning against the environmental destruction caused by Shell, Chevron and others in the Niger Delta. And for that campaigning, he and 8 others were executed on November the 10th, 1995, as well as thousands of other Ogoni people being killed in military crackdowns with the collaboration and support of Shell. And since that shocking tragedy and complete waste of life and human rights abuses in the Niger Delta, we've seen this new sort of evolving myth, I would say, of corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility was essentially, its origins came out of the aftermath of Saro-Wiwa's execution. But I think, I think most of us are pretty jaded insofar as assessing the potential of corporate social responsibility to actually address long-standing grievances, environmental destruction, and human rights abuses. And in the Niger Delta itself, we frequently see corporations complicit in extrajudicial executions, torture, detainment of activists, and the shooting of protesters. And so I would really question whether anything can be learned or has been learned from these sort of shocking mass-scale disasters that erupt into the media, that erupt into the international community, without extensive activism and enforcement of regulation on an industry which, in our view, has to be forced to prioritize protection of the environment over profit.
Well, Ben, leave it there. That's fantastic. Okay, so there's a huge amount of... Simon and Chris, I mean, okay, is the industry able to change? I mean, does it want to change, or is it just going to go on? Has the risks got to get greater and greater before it learns? What will make it learn, if anything? Was it activism, or is it bottom line profits?
Well, I think we've had this delicious myth for the last 10 years that the magic market solves all the problems, and governments have gone into semi-retirement and sort of pensioned off all the regulators. Now, in the financial crisis, we've learned that, yes, of course, corporations are there to make money. That's what their articles of association say. But what governments are there to do is make sure they don't act in a wholly irresponsible way. Well, what we saw in the banking crisis was the abject failure to regulate the banks, and we saw that the people at the top of the banks were happily looking the other way, while people lower down took quite unreasonable risks, confident in the knowledge that they'd get the bonus and someone else would pick up the tab. Well, we actually have a direct parallel here. The oil industry is keen to stay in business, obviously enough. It knows no one has made any real efforts to move away from oil. We consume about 85 million barrels a day. We lose between 3 and 4 million barrels a day per year to depletion, so we've got to replace that and more if we're to meet incremental demand. And deep offshore oil represents 5 million barrels a day between now and 2014. So it's a huge financial prize. So of course the industry is going to go after that, and it's going to go after that hell for leather. What we've seen, and we've seen this in the States, the total corruption of the regulators themselves, who are nodding off things they shouldn't even have agreed to allow to be done. What we see on rigs is very complicated sort of bonus arrangements where there's huge incentives to get things done quickly, to bring things in faster, to drill quicker and the rest of it. They, like the bankers, have this asymmetric bit because they get the bonus and the rest of us get the bill. Because the other thing that the corporations have worked out is if they have these huge clean-up costs, as this morning's Financial Times was elegantly pointing out, all they do is they take it as a cost against their tax. So the US taxpayer and the UK taxpayer are going to end up as the people spending most to clean up the Gulf of Mexico.
I think there are two things here. I think the wash-up will tell whether or how much corruption or how many shortcuts were made. But even if you have the most rigorous safety checks, the most rigorous mechanisms in place, there is no such thing as a fail-safe. If there was such thing as a fail-safe, we would never have another plane crash. Planes are designed to not crash; they crash. And even if you doubled the cost of the fail-safe mechanisms on the oil rigs, sooner or later you'd have an accident. Nature's like that; it kicks back. So we have to accept the fact that however much money, however many safety regulations we put in place, these accidents will happen. It'll happen again. This won't be the first one, it won't be the last. Supertankers go aground at a regular rate. Okay, the number and the rate at which supertankers go aground is reducing with double-hull tankers, with much stricter safety regulations, but accidents still happen. It's called human nature, it's called nature itself. The people who want the oil are you lot, us, me, you. And actually, the driving force isn't necessarily BP, it is profit, but at the end of the day, if BP turned around and said, okay, we can double the safety of our oil rigs, but it's going to cost you 20p per litre. I can tell you now, half the drivers in this country will be driving up the motorway protesting about how much petrol's costing. So you need to decide, we need to decide, not as BP or as an industry, but actually as individuals, well, how much are we willing to pay for the oil that we use to make it safer? And I think, yes, we can blame BP, we can blame the American government, we can blame Halliburton, all these people. At the end of the day, the people who want the oil are people like you and me. And in the case of the Gulf spill, that oil was destined for the US market, and if it wasn't there, the American market would have been the people jumping up and down saying, where's our oil, why is it costing so much money? And I think, it's up to you.
Yeah, but I mean, is the industry aware of this, or is it actually very cynical about the whole thing? It doesn't really give a hoot. It expects a blowout like this every so often. I mean, is this part of its business plan that it will take a hit every so often? I mean,
You're being very provocative.
I'm just asking. I'm dying to know.
We're all human beings, and I have to say that within a company like BP or others, there is not a cynical approach. I think the big issue is
But are they just incompetent?
No, the big issue is this. For much of what we see in the oil industry, there are very well-defined international procedures. So even drilling a well in 1,500 meters of water, which was the case here, there are procedures, and 1,500 meters is not the deepest in the world. The deepest is of the order of 3,000 meters, or perhaps even more.
About 3,000.
So these are well-defined procedures, and one of the key things we have to ask ourselves, and this will come out of the various investigations, including one by the Chemical Safety Board in the US, it's basically the two questions. Were the procedures adequate or inadequate? And if they were adequate, were they nevertheless not complied with? And these are fundamental questions, and they're the same sorts of questions that would have been asked following the Piper Alpha disaster in the 1980s. So we need to find out what the outcome of that is. But then the other thing I would state is that the oil industry is actually an incredibly diverse industry and highly compartmentalized. There are very few people, and I guess maybe I'm fortunate in having seen refining, exploration, production, and chemicals, but there are very few people who've seen the whole supply chain. And there are very few chief executives who can talk and understand in a competent way what is drilling, what is refining, and so on. And therefore, you could imagine that in the whole skills supply chain of an oil company, if you have a drilling engineer even trying to explain the risks to you, and you are not familiar with drilling, but your background is refining or something else, it becomes almost incomprehensible. And I think part of the trouble is this compartmentalization and the fact that even within the oil industry, even within a single company, you can be talking a different language. If I talk of downhole valves, safety valves, and BOPs and so on, that is completely incomprehensible to a refining engineer. And that therein, I think, lies one of the problems. It's communication within even one company, let alone across the wider scope of the oil industry.
Chris, coming, because you were saying earlier that in a way we're quite lucky that it was BP and not one of these smaller companies, because they don't actually have at least BP had the resources. Is this going to become more frequent because it is the smaller companies which are going into the deep water areas? I mean, should we now expect more problems from the smaller companies?
No, I think actually, paradoxically, we're in danger of getting the reverse effect. The reverse effect would simply be that the smaller companies are going to find it very, very difficult to get involved in deep water drilling, because in effect they've seen one of the largest, richest company on the planet apparently almost brought to its knees. And you know, what board, however remote the risk, is going to sanction that sort of involvement? Now the danger here is it becomes literally a sort of 5-company club of the companies that are rich enough to self-insure, which is what the biggest ones do. And the real danger you're seeing is, of course, is American legislators want to remove the ceiling on compensation, have an unlimited. Well, you know, no board can sanction any activity which has an unlimited liability associated with it. So were they to create an unlimited liability, the Gulf would simply go very quiet. No one would do any drilling at all, because even the Exxons of this world couldn't afford to do it. I mean, they might ring up the US government and ask if they're indemnified, but that would be defeating your own law. So this, if you like, is one of the problems, that you will make it a very tight oligopoly if you have very high liabilities and very restricted conditions, because the next tier of companies down just wouldn't be able to get the insurance, wouldn't be able to sanction it, wouldn't be able to participate.
But that means by extension that if you want to stop the oil industry, which is presumably where you're coming in, then you want basically these kind of accidents to happen so that the insurance gets so great that nobody can possibly go into to drill for oil. So in other words, the whole industry collapses upon itself. Is that sort of...
Well, I mean, that would be one way of doing it, if you like, but actually it would make the thing catastrophically worse, because the oil industry would then have no option but to go to the countries that weren't regulated or where the government was most immediately bribable. and you know, that would be the complete nightmare, wouldn't it? That would be Nigeria Delta Plus.
Jesus. Coming back.
I think they're doing a good enough job destroying themselves actually at the moment, because I mean, if you look at, for instance, you mentioned the sort of the notion of unlimited liability. I think this is a really key point as well, which has been sort of borne out by the Deepwater Horizon disaster, which is that essentially the disaster itself is an unlimited liability for BP at the moment. I mean, there are varying estimates of, you know, the cost of cleanup and so on, and the cost of other associated risks that BP will have to now pay for. But, you know, this is just estimates, really. So essentially, you know, a disaster happening on the sea floor in a deep, so-called deep water environment does represent an unlimited liability, and yet, simultaneously, the industry is going for it with guns blazing. I mean, you know, deep water is seen as has been pointed out, as a significant portion of future production for the Western oil majors. So I think we have to question the rationale of essentially this sort of idea of going for oil anywhere that it can be found, you know, even if that means thousands of miles below the sea surface. And in addition to that, you know, it doesn't make financial sense as well. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the Exxon Valdez disaster, which was, you know, the last oil spill of this kind of order or magnitude, the costs of cleanup were, I believe, around $4.5 billion.
Yeah, about £2 billion.
Right, right. So we're now looking at a step change from that, which is so significant that it could be 10 times as much as a cost. And so the economics of this, the liabilities involved, are essentially straining the financial markets beyond belief. So, you know, it doesn't make economic sense for the majors to be plumbing the depths and for going for frontier oil, or what was last year called unconventional oil. And the same thing goes for Canada's tar sands, where BP and Shell are both deeply invested in essentially clearing oil from the earth, which has had a huge and devastating impact on the environment of local communities and is basically one of the most dirtiest fuels in terms of carbon emissions known on the planet. This rush to find oil wherever it exists just has completely lost its rationale. It doesn't make economic sense, and it's exposing the environment to huge risks.
But Simon, is there a, well, I was going to say, is there an ultimate nightmare for the oil industry that something goes wrong, which just is a can it get worse?
I mean, the point you made earlier, we run our societies on oil and energy. Without that, you know, we would all be much poorer. There's no way around that, and the efforts on the unconventionals and the alternatives are really all in their fairly early stages. They are not a viable option. So what we're seeing here is the oil industry itself, a very rich, powerful industry, is hardly going to fold its tent and say this is a fair cop gun. What they're going to do is they're going to spend a very great deal of money to show that they can drill safely in great water depths, that they can dig up tar sands in an acceptable way. Now, you may wish to say that they won't succeed and it's still undesirable and the rest of it. But until we confront the idea that we've got an oil-based society and we haven't actually got an alternative, a serious alternative, anything like in place, then we remain very dependent on oil. Now, would you prefer to depend on the oil industry pushing various frontiers, or would you prefer to depend on OPEC, who may elect to turn you off or to charge 4 times as much, having got a very constrained situation? Now, my own view is we're going to get to this sort of nightmare in due course anyway. But even I can't see any great reason to rush there. I mean, it's
I think Obama was very much misquoted early on in this spill, as saying that he was quoted as saying he compared this to America's 9/11 in environmental terms. What he actually said was that 9/11 made Americans sit up and realise that the rest of the world had terrorism and it had problems. This oil spill, I think, has made Americans sit up and realise that actually this sort of thing is going on in Nigeria, it's going on in other places as well. And it's actually made them sit up and think, as the world's biggest consumer of oil, just with India and China catching up rapidly, it's made them sit up and think, actually, this has a cost. It's not just a cost in terms of what it costs in terms of money, it has a cost in terms of environmental impact. And it's actually brought that message home. And it's the same with anything. If it's happening somewhere else, you're not really worried about it in reality. If it's happening in your backyard and garden, then it has a big impact. And I think, you know, there is no such thing as a positive spin in an oil spill, but it does make politicians, it does make people stop and think. Then it has one, albeit small, positive.
But I mean, do you detect any change in the culture of the oil? Do you detect that there are worries that people are sort of concerned that perhaps they are doing something wrong?
I think the facts are quite interesting. Right now, about 80% of all the world's energy comes from oil and gas and coal. All right, so hydrocarbons represent 80% of all the energy provision. The rest is biomass, and then 3% is wind and hydro and so on. So the real point I'm making is that about 80%, despite all the, you could say, the huffing and puffing over the last 10, 15 years, 80% still comes from hydrocarbons, and oil is about 36%, gas is of the order of, I think, 24%. The startling fact, despite what you might read in the press, the startling fact is that if you lock people from the major oil companies in a room and say, what is going to happen in 2050, then the very startling fact is that in 2050, oil production could be very much the same as today. And that's even from, well, that's from conventional sources, some use of shales, but that is the possibility. And therefore, if we're talking about addressing environmental issues, there's a very big risk-benefit assessment to be done. But if we're looking at carbon dioxide emissions, there's a very important issue to address, in the sense that if by 2050 oil production is the same as today, and yet the world, particularly the UK, is committed to going to 20% of that in terms of emissions, how is that going to be achieved? It's going to be carbon capture and storage, but it's also going to have to be renewables, but renewables in a sense that major oil producing countries are going to have to be effectively shut down. You know, there's a massive geopolitical issue here. To achieve the reductions of emissions by 2050, if we do not have carbon capture and storage, it means that Saudi Arabia, it means that the US, it means that Angola, it means that Kuwait, Iraq, they're all going to have to shut down production. So you have a major geopolitical issue.
I'm going to bring Chris in here, because I know your views on I mean, 2050 were basically over the hill and down the other side.
Yes, we're way down the slope by that point. So
just spell it out.
But that's your
what is it? Spell out 2050. Where are we if we go on at this rate?
Well, the oil production would be 50, 60 million barrels, I suppose.
So we've declined by 30%.
Yeah, that sort of thing. I mean, the great excitable hope at the moment is unconventional gas, which can help to bridge us. But the brutal answer is we don't know. We've built a society in a particular way. We derive great benefit from that. We now find that is producing a whole series of challenges, from the environmental through the global warming, the CO2 emissions, and the just physical supply. And yeah, we're really not concentrating very hard, because this is the big threat to our society. I mean, in one sense, we've got to solve this problem. In a tautological sense, we will solve it. But like many things in life, there's a nice way to solve it and a nasty way to solve it. I mean, a perpetual economic recession will do a lot to reduce demand and take the pressure off the system, but I don't think any of us would fancy that very much. So it's trying to really come to grips with the fact that this entity, which has been, go back a stage, the reason we've built a society based on oil is quite simple. For most of the 20th century, it was cheap and it was plentiful. Simple as that. And if something's cheap and plentiful, then all sorts of bright people start inventing all sorts of clever things to do with it. And that's exactly what we did. And we learned exactly what it did, how it worked, and it has a huge energy density, so it was wonderful stuff. Cheap oil essentially ended in 2005. $75, which is today's price, is the 4th highest in a year of any year in history, going right back. It's 1860 when you might wish it's an exception. So it's already very expensive. Already that will start to force some adaptations, but on the whole, we're pretty well asleep about this. We're sort of toying with the problem. We're not really coming to terms with it. And in those circumstances, the industry, which has no desire to die, is obviously going to fight as hard as it can to find as much as possible to make it last for as long as possible. That's quite natural. There's always a counter-reaction to any movement. Now, do we wish to rush into moving away from it? At one level, yes, we do. But at another level, we can't do that without considerable economic damage to ourselves at a time when Western economies are not exactly in great shape.
But on the other hand, I mean, why can't we get to this renewable society? We had Germany the other day saying, well, by 2050 we could be completely dependent on renewables. We've got Britain, which is committed legally to getting roughly to that point. You've got Western society. I mean, you're just saying we can't give it up.
There's a great danger that the big industry says we can't do it, and it's big industry saying that.
Industry will do whatever it takes.
Industry will do what it takes. So I mean, good examples on a much smaller scale. Lead in petrol. Industry said we can't possibly run lead-free petrol. Cars will blow up. It'll cost too much money for the fuel. I didn't actually notice any difference. And actually, lead-free petrol came in. It was legislated. It worked. You know, cars I think are more reliable these days, aren't they? The petrol hasn't gone up in cost, in true cost. CFCs at the time were destroying the ozone layer. It was suggested that we ban CFCs, and there was a unilateral banning of CFCs. And at the time, manufacturers said, "Well, that means the end of spray aerosols. You'll never see another aerosol in your life." I've not noticed any difference on the supermarket shelves. Now, okay, these are minor things compared to the oil industry, but industry will respond. If you suddenly stopped tomorrow and said, "Okay, as from tomorrow, we'll have no more oil," I can guarantee BP will be first on the market with an electric car. And they'll have hydrogen cells, they'll have biofuels. And okay, there are all kinds of issues on that. The other thing is, yes, if you put a group of oil executives into a room and said, how long will the oil last? They'll say, we'll keep this current levels going until 2050. I'm worried about 2051. And I'm also worried about the fact that the population of the planet is expanding rapidly. And India are coming online now. I was working out in India last year, and in India they brought this car out, the Nano. And every Indian's desire is to have a Nano. It's not even a question of they're advertising the Nano, they're advertising on billboards. How can you afford your Nano? So they're actually advertising the loans to buy the Nano rather than the Nano itself. The Nano is taken as wanted. Talking to Indian politicians, they're saying this is great because look, we produce a car that is a quarter of the emissions of something like a Ford Fiesta or an example of a typical car in Europe. I said that's great, but bear in mind that in 10 years' time, there are going to be millions of these things compared to the hundreds of thousands of Ford Fiestas. So yes, this is great because you've produced a car that produces much less emission. But if there are 4 times as many of these cars, we've got a huge problem. And those cars are consuming this oil that we've been taking so far. So there's going to be a shortage of oil here because India are going to say, we're going to pay more for our oil, we want the oil for our nanos. What are we going to do then?
Then there's another issue that, for instance, China is developing extraordinarily.
Yes.
As is India. And of course, as oil becomes more difficult to access, and do bear in mind, it's not, it hasn't missed the attention of a lot of people that China is very much into Africa, forming joint ventures with oil companies there to access oil. But when that runs out, or when that becomes scarce, then the drive is to use coal, and the gasification of coal, or the liquefaction of coal, to make the equivalent of petrol from coal. And that is incredibly carbon dioxide intensive, actually. And if you talk to Chinese government officials at a senior level, and you say to them, well, how do you balance the prosperity of China versus the reduction in carbon dioxide emissions and global warming for the world, then it's a no-brainer. The priority is to provide prosperity to China. And therefore there is the risk that whatever happens to oil itself, whether it runs out or not, because of the vast amount of coal there is in China, that will be liquefied to petrol, and that will increase carbon dioxide emissions still further. So really, the point I want to make is that there have to be very important, tough, almost geopolitical discussions about the way ahead. We're going to have to live with oil and gas for a while, but there are some very, very tough decisions to be made.
Okay, right, let's leave it here. Your turn. Do you want to ask questions? If you come from any specific area which is relevant, make the point, say who you are, and ask any questions you like. And okay, one at the back.
My name is Ed Viliami.
Oh, you're Ed.
Speaking in a personal capacity. I mean, this session was supposed to be called The Politics of Oil, and we've heard a lot about oil, but I haven't heard much politics.
Well, this is where you come in.
Slightly sort of beginning of an attempt over here, but not much development of it. I think it's quite interesting what you said, sir, about the American public. I think it's quite interesting that, you know, every BP advert I saw in the United States recently has a paint bucket emptied against it and a lot of bullet holes in the. And I find this extremely gratifying. Whether it's the right or wrong target, at least there is a little bit of politics involved. I think. My question is, we're stuck here. I mean, President Obama has come up for a lot of stick on this, but at least he's put the gallows on the hill. And we haven't talked about politics. We haven't talked about the corporatocracy. We haven't talked about the corporatization of politics and the corruption thereby of politics. We talked a lot about oil, but nothing about politics. The problem is, Obama's put the gallows up there, and I think a lot of people are a little bit confused. Who should hang? And there are three options, really, and the questions to the panel and also to the chairman. BP, because it's there, we read again in the Herald Trib this morning. There was plenty of warning, it needn't and shouldn't and couldn't have happened. As for their sponsorship of the Tate, well, expletives excused. Option 2, deregulation, which you began to talk about but didn't finish, or no one. Is this just another, bit like the MP's expenses, a lot of huffle and guffle, and actually the gallows just stand there and no one swings? Who swings? BP, deregulation, or no one?
Okay, right. Who will take that one on? Ben, come on. It's hanging a lot.
Okay, I'll give it a go. I think that there has to be much more responsibility. In fact, individual responsibility is something that that Platform has been pushing for a long time now, and that's partly due to the fact that if you have oil executives in the dock on criminal charges for negligence, for taking the wrong decisions in relation to cutting corners on health and safety, which has resulted in this disaster, that will send a much stronger message to the wider industry in terms of changing behavior. But I think that unfortunately it looks like we're a long way from that kind of an eventuality, as much as we would argue that has to happen. Now, I would say that what we have seen previously and what we do continue to see is essentially the fact that the oil industry, due to its structure, depends upon long-term political support in its host and home countries. And so essentially, the companies will be putting an enormous amount of resources into keeping good relations, into pensioning off the regulators and so on, wherever they operate. I mean, we see this in Nigeria to a sort of grossly caricatured extent, whereby essentially the only people who benefit from the oil wealth are the oil companies and the ruling elite of Nigeria. And of course, there's absolutely no regulation effectively on oil spills in Nigeria. And so we have to exploit the fact that a wedge has been driven in between the cozy relationships with the US government, with the UK government, and the oil companies such as BP, Shell, and so on. As campaigners, we have to do that. And that's partly because I think that that wedge can also be completely withdrawn. I mean, we've already seen Cameron and Boris Johnson jumping to the defense of BP. And, you know, and so this is one indication that, you know, whilst there's never been more criticism of BP, it's clear that, you know, the Conservative government has chosen, you know, to put its support into the private interests involved, rather than the more public, global interest in having a commons that is actually surviving, rather than a completely polluted ocean. And so, you know, it's not a given that the relationships will be strained between governments and oil companies. This is something that we have to continue to work on. And in Platform, we tend to see this sort of the web of actors around oil companies as a carbon web. And essentially, our work is targeted at trying to weaken the links between the oil companies and those institutions that surround them and facilitate their ability to extract wealth and to, you know, put risk onto the public rather than actually pay for the damage that they've done.
Should we hang you? Do you think?
Yeah, why not? Let me just impart a little of my own experience. I've been involved in regulators throughout the world, whether it's US, Angola, India.
Have you bought them? Have you corrupted them?
I haven't quite corrupted them, no. But what I will say is that your typical regulator is often very much a very middle ability retired individual from the oil industry. There is not a great deal of challenge in the system, whether you're looking at African countries, South American, even Europe and the UK. And so one of the big issues is that the regulator has never exercised the teeth that it has. And what is interesting, particularly in the UK, and I guess it's even true in the US, we're not just talking about oil. You're talking about all things, everything from even education to oil. The regulatory processes are very, very weak because over time you're employing people who are, and I guess I shouldn't say this, but I need to, they're no great shakes and they're not well led. Most regulatory bodies have to be led. If they're to be effective, you've got to be led by somebody who's decisive and charismatic. That rarely happens. And so you get a real fudge of things, and I guess my experience, it does indeed extend between education and oil and gas, and I can tell you that that is the problem. And I wouldn't be surprised if the MMS in the States exhibits these precise characteristics. Poor quality, lack of leadership, too cozy a relationship with the oil companies. And it's this is one of the issues that has to be addressed. Otherwise, you won't correct it. You need real decisiveness, real leadership.
But Ed, I mean, let's come back to you. I mean, are you saying that we should just close down these companies and completely and just abolish them, or get out of oil, let's get back into wind, or whatever it may be, or nuclear? I mean, what is your take on that in political terms? How can we respond?
John, I defer that question to you. You know what you're talking about, I don't. It's just that in a session entitled The Politics of Oil, we have not heard much about, well, we've started to now, about what during the Bush administration was the Halliburton-Cheney administration, about the clout that these companies have, the corporatocracy generally. I mean, to shift gears a little, let's see how efficient deregulation and the profit motive has made the railway system in this country, or the transport system in this city. I mean, it's chaos, it's disastrous, it's absurd, it's deregulated, and it's bottom of the league in Europe, according to the University of Stuttgart, and quite rightly so. Oil seems to be going the same way. My question really was, you know, when it was suggested that within a few months' time this will all be faint memory because the spill is relatively small and the American media happens to be more cogent in drawing attention to what's happening in the Gulf than in Nigeria. But, yeah, sorry, questions. You know, I find it extremely gratifying what you said, that the American people are finally, but the environment is now number 2 on the list. It's above immigration. It's above crime as a concern. So where does it go? Does it just go down the drain of this twat saying he wants to get his life back? Or does somebody actually go to jail and get swung for this? Because as you said, sir, you know, they reap the bonuses, we pay the money. It's like the banks. Where does it end?
Chris, okay, come back, Chris.
Well, I would advocate a triple hanging. I mean, I think we've got to have serious sacrifice at the top of the oil company. It means
so Haywood goes.
Haywood goes. The chairman goes. I mean, what on earth? You know, a chairman from Ericsson, because Shell had got one from Nokia.
Do they sell it? Do they change the name? What do they do?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think they necessarily need to change the name, but within the society of the company, people have got to realise, in a very profound sense, that screwing up, you know, means the end of your career, means, you know, something really serious. It doesn't just mean the bonus has been deferred, or that, you know, you'll reach for a lawyer who'll get you out of the problem. So yes, I would advocate a good hanging, and if necessary, people going to jail, because that's the only thing that will really engrave it in executive minds that something has got to be done. Regulators also need a good hanging, because that whole sector has got to be shaken up, it's got to be better paid, it's got to be better done, and also, it also has got to cease this cozy relationship and actually do what it's required to do. And the third hanging would have to be someone in government, because for too long we've had these absolutely absurd idée fixe that, you know, giving the people cheap electricity or cheap oil or cheap gasoline or whatever, you know, was the way to their hearts, and any shortcuts on the way would ultimately be acceptable. Well, the answer is they're not acceptable. We've got to start thinking a bit differently.
And I think the regulators are under pressure from both government and the producers. On the one hand, BP or Shell or Esso or any of the oil companies are going to be leaning on the regulators to cut back on the safety measures needed. And they're going to get supported to a certain extent by governments, because the governments make money. You know, the American government made money on the licensing for these oil fields. They'll make money on the taxes from the oil that's then produced. So, unfortunately, the two ends of the scale, the industry and the government that controls the regulators, both have a vested interest in making it as profitable as possible. And that's where the thing falls down. The regulator is caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, Ben, I mean, come in, because I mean, surely what this has done is it's shown certainly America and maybe the British government and others that that oil is a very, very expensive solution, and maybe it has given enormous strength to the politics of renewables or other things. I mean, can you see anything changing there that industry will actually begin to move towards the renewables quite seamlessly?
I'd hope so, but I think the reality is you know, not as rosy as that. I mean, you know, looking at BP, for instance, as you will well know, you know, there was sort of a genuine momentum in BP for many years, starting from the 1970s, to advance solar power technology and to diversify its portfolio of renewable energy, and that really sort of spurred on in the sort of from the mid-1990s, I'd say, up until really the departure of Lord Brown and the changeover to Tony Haywood. But really, you know, what has become of that? Well, by 2008, the sort of percentage of turnover that was down to renewable energy sources, non-hydrocarbon energy sources within BP was less than 2%. And if this is the end result of, you know, one of Britain, or one of the largest Western oil companies in the world, led by, you know, the sort of top you know, scientists and engineers and so on, if this is the end result, 2%, then what hope is there really for a kind of a sea change in the energy sources that we're relying on through BP away from hydrocarbons? So I think it's looking pretty bleak, and Tony Hayward has done a lot to basically, I guess, just completely shut down BP's renewable projects to a great extent. And a similar story is basically playing itself out in its twin sister Shell. We just see this complete minimization of renewables, despite the best of intentions within those companies. And so we come back to this, we bump up against this problem continually of the corporate structure itself. Unless we change that, unless we change the motives that drive this company forward, then we're not going to really see dramatic changes on these fronts. And I just sort of add another point in, which is that it's been mentioned that as a society we're addicted to oil, we all use oil and so on. It's a fairly obvious point, but I would prefer to try and sort of flip that addiction, that complicity on its head. Because if you look at these companies such as BP and Shell, they're so ubiquitous. They sponsor our cultural institutions such as the Tate, the British Museum, and so on. They are so pervasive in all of our walks of life. But we also are a part of them, because most likely the banks that many of you will be saving your money with, the pension schemes that most of you will be on, will be investing their money into Shell and BP, because Shell and BP are such a large portion of the FTSE 100. And so, in a sense, we all, by association, own a chunk of these companies. We have a stake, we have a say. And so in terms of activism, there's so much more that we can do as people who are, whether it's by our own direct choice or otherwise, invested into this industry. We have to live up to that responsibility, and we have to change that complicity into something positive that demands that these companies are held responsible, that demands higher standards, and that demands and shifts them away from unsustainable sources of energy.
Chris, but such as the politics of oil is that if we in Britain don't use it, or in America for some reason they don't use it, other people are going to use it, aren't they? So is the only solution effectively that we have we run out? I mean, are we? Is it possible that we can get to a point where the price of oil gets so high that we cannot use it, and then we have to then go into other types of energy? I mean, is there a sort of solution to this one?
There is no solution. Let me give you what I regard as a key fact. There's 6.8 billion of us on this planet. 1 billion of us live in the rich part of the world, the comfortable part of the world. We use 52% of the oil, 40%, 7% of the gas, and 37% of the coal or something. So we're taking basically half the energy. The other 5.8 are sharing it out between themselves. They are getting richer, and some of them are getting richer very rapidly. The point was already made. They have aspirations very similar to ourselves. So any second now there is going to be there's going to be real competition. And as you suggested, it may be that the added value to an Indian may be greater than the added value to us, at which point logically they will be able to pay more than we can pay. Now we're absolutely asleep at the wheel on this. We haven't even begun to look at this or even start thinking in this way. Also, if you look at all the projections of population, the billion stays fairly constant. It's not really increasing that rich chunk of the world. But the percentage of the world energy that will be available to us is naturally going to go down. And the rest of that 5.8 is going to go up to 7.8 or 8.8 or what, depending on which date you take, obviously enough. Now, logically we cannot say that we want this stuff for ourselves, though that does seem to be an intellectual fallback position, this idea that we're so rich that it will always come our way. Well, the answer is no, we're not. And so we've really got to start thinking now in a very positive way as to how we do things differently. I mean, after all, if we were talking 100 years ago, we'd have had a coal-based economy, and that would not seem special to us. And yet we totally moved away from that. We adapted, we recreated another one, and we're going to have to do it again. I mean, collectively, we're very smart, we're very adaptable. But my constant refrain is this idea that no one is really facing up to this. We're just assuming that a few more oil fields will be found, that the price will stay reasonable, we can go on doing much what we're doing.
So expect shocks. Okay, so one question here, one question there, please.
So I would like, it's Masato Kimura of the Japanese Sankei newspaper.
Sorry, the Japanese?
Sankei newspaper.
Right.
I would like to question politics and oil in different way. I read the British Petroleum homepage, and British Petroleum started in Iran, and First World War and Second World War, you stick to the state. And after Iran Revolution, you went to deep water. I think so. It is less politics now, because you have to escape the political risk in Middle East. And so now China step in Iran, and so the industry maybe go to deep water to escape political risk. And so how do you think the industry evaluates the political risk and accidental risk in Deep Horizon? And so and in the future, how deep they will go? For example, Greenland, offshore Greenland, and also Antarctic.
Can I make a stab at this?
Yeah, political risk.
I think it's extremely interesting the way the oil industry has changed. Increasingly, there are the national oil corporations that take a very significant part of oil production. So you have, it's effectively the Kuwait government, the Saudi government, it's the Indian government, it's the Angolan government. Those governmental or state oil corporations have a very dominant role, and the role of what we call the international oil companies, the Shell, BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, is actually becoming less and less. And so what's happening is that those international oil companies are doing two things. They can either try to almost go it alone, or they do form joint ventures with these national oil corporations. And it is the balance between, let's put it this way, if you have N billion pounds and you are an international oil corporation, do you try to go it alone, or do you try to form joint ventures with national oil corporations? And that is the grand strategy that all oil companies have to face. Going offshore doesn't necessarily mean you escape being involved with national oil corporations. And so there are a number of companies in collaboration with, let's say, Sonangol in Angola, state company, but you have Chevron, you have Japanese companies involved in joint ventures there. India is far more, in a sense, nationalistic. It doesn't really allow too many foreign oil companies in. Malaysia, you have joint ventures. Brazil, you have joint ventures. So you have this mix of things going on, but the key thing that comes through is that actually, despite all the discussion we've had today, the role of the international oil companies is probably going to become less in the future, and it will be these state companies that become more significant. And therein lies the other issue I raised, that if you're going to try to curtail carbon dioxide emissions and oil usage, actually you increasingly target those countries whose GDP increasingly depends on oil and gas. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Angola. And therefore, this is the geopolitical issue. that I'm introducing, that really to address the longer term issues is a far more political issue than most people recognise.
I mean, Ben.
Just mention Russia, because what struck me is actually, you know, Russia is a massive oil producer. It's actually been top for several years in the past decade. And we talk about, we talk about, you know, we've talked about China, and of course what we have missed is the fact that the Gazproms of this world are courting China, etc. And, you know, I've just very interested that geopolitically we haven't come across Russia yet. I happen to have worked there in the oil industry, so it's very interesting for me. And I think the other point is we've talked about the NOJs, the national oil companies, and of course I've seen what the health and safety record is in Russia. There's a lot less regulation there.
And also, I mean, Russia is a good example because I think, you know, if you look at the US, there's a drive in the US to go to the Gulf because it's local waters. They can control it as a government. I suspect the thought within the US of being able to having to rely on Russia and on the Middle East even for its oil supplies is quite horrifying. I mean, Russia's shown what they can do. If they don't like a country, they turn the tap off. End of story. They wait a couple of months and then they get the country coming to them, hands on their knees saying, we're terribly sorry, we won't do it again. And I mean, this is very much how the oil politics works. The oil politics is a way of changing the balance. You know, you're talking about geopolitics. It's a bit like saying, you know, we won't stop opium because it's unfair to certain South American countries. Where do you draw the line? If it's harming our society, if it's actually harming our environment, where do we draw the line?
And that's because it's a big issue for us in the West, but it's not so big an issue across the board in other places. And I know from my time there, you know what the winter's like in Russia.
Yeah.
My heating bill was about £10 a month because it's all subsidised. And that's a fundamental legacy from the Soviet system. So what do you suddenly do? Go and charge the Russians Western prices? You know, it's such a huge issue. And I think one thing that struck me from this debate is how, in some respects, we've so isolated the oil companies in our minds. It's almost like if you work for an oil company, you can't be ecologically minded. If you work for an oil company, you can't really care about these things. I think there is a lot of that perception.
But it comes back to the whole thing. It is down to us as individuals. And I don't mean just us here in this room. I mean individuals in China, individuals in India, deciding how do they want their society to go forward. Now, actually, if you're looking at the long-term impact of fossil fuel use, and we ignore the spill for the moment, but look at the impact of increased CO2. Ironically, the countries that are going to be most impacted by those changes are going to be countries like India and China. You know, if one is very honest about it, you look at the hard facts of climate change. Western Europe isn't going to be devastated by climate change. India will be devastated by climate change. So in some ways, there's that need for education to say, look, you can go down this route. But you're a young country. If you go down, you could start off with an infrastructure which is built on alternative technologies. And they are there. You know, people say, well, they're not ready to roll out yet. They're ready to roll out. It just needs that incentive to say, okay, let's do it. I'll go back to when I was in India. In India, I said, well, why didn't Tata develop an electric nano? And they said, well, the technology's not there yet. Ironically, that evening in my hotel room, watching the CNN news, the Chinese had announced the launch of their first mass-produced electric car that was going to produce by the million. Now, okay, there's a whole politics of how is the energy produced in the first place. But it's a starting point. And if there's that awareness, if you actually start building these new societies, these new industries, these new economies on a greener technology, then maybe we can break away from the oil.
Okay, next question, one here, please. Okay.
Thanks very much for a very interesting, discussion so far. As we bring up this issue of geopolitics, and you talk about it's a situation where the people who will be affected most of those in the countries who have the lowest GDP per head, India, China, etc. So we need some kind of a system where those people benefit from many alternative technologies. Maybe the people in countries that can afford it pay, and it's a geopolitical problem. So we tried to put in place something like Kyoto and the carbon system, and that clearly failed, or sorry, is failing. So what other solutions are there?
Can I make a... Brief comment?
Yeah, brief comment. I'm going to come in as well. So.
Brief comment is that I'd say over the last few years there has been a complete lack of political leadership in establishing the framework. You could say any entity, whether it's a company or a country, actually needs a framework. And by framework I mean a regulatory framework, a fiscal framework, so that what they do is determined by rules. So they know if they do this, then they can get this profit. If they do this, then this is the impact, this is the opportunities. And globally, we have failed to identify that framework. Things have been fudged, whether it's Kyoto, whether it's Copenhagen. And that is the big issue. We need decisive leadership to lay the ground rules with good evidence-based science in the widest sense, politics and natural sciences. We have lacked that.
Yeah, I don't know if we have actually. I mean, I'm going to come in on a but I mean, if you go back 10 years, 15 years, we've actually made an enormous conceptual progress in the politics of oil. I mean, we are now firmly debating whether we become renewable societies. So in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Britain, in wherever. This is, even in America, for God's sake, we are actually making a very, very big jump. So within a generation, we are beginning to completely orient ourselves to the future without oil, with a much lower carbon future, which is fantastic, and it is undermining, I would say, very much the whole oil industry, and which I would think is effectively knows it's on the rocks, and hasn't got very much longer to go. That's why it's going hell for fucking leather to get the oil out of Brazil or the deep water in the Gulf. So it's this. I think this is the kind of the last straw. This is the end game of a very, very grim century which we've had, which has just been nothing but sort of awful, god-awful pollution and whatever. And actually we have got an awful lot to look forward to. And we've seen it in China, we've seen fantastic development of renewables there. We're seeing the same in parts of Europe and in America, for God's sake. And I think we're sort of locked into seeing this all as a sort of grim thing. I have to say, in a bizarre way, I see this Gulf thing as a fantastically good idea. It's actually exactly what's needed. In fact, we needed to go on for another year or 2 years because the whole of the Gulf was completely fucked anyway, and get rid of the last fish there, and then let's get down to changing completely. But I don't expect any of you agree with that.
I don't. I think you're saying Copenhagen was a disaster. It didn't produce anything. I would disagree. Copenhagen, actually, you had all the politicians arguing about how to reduce carbon, how to break away from the oil culture. If you go back to Kyoto, the arguments were, is this a real reality? The arguments there were, well, global climate change isn't a problem, all the scientists are wrong. There was no disagreement about the problem in Copenhagen. The disagreement was, how do you solve the problem? And I think that's the whole point. I think we're now moving from, what's the problem? We know what the problem is, and I don't think, okay, there are a few people from the Bush administration who still think that climate change is a myth. But I mean, I think, there's a general push now towards the fact that we know there's a problem. The problem is, how do we solve the problem? And that's where you come back to the politics. And that's, where does science and politics cross? Where do we get involved with the politics? I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, one man's got to go. There's an oil-burning taxi outside for him.
to have an interview about oil.
Well, there you go. Well, you tell them. You tell them that the mood of this is to sort of hang the CEOs and get out of oil.
I'll do my best.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Okay, another question, please. Okay, have you just asked one?
Thank you very much. I joined the oil industry 31 years ago, and I've been in and around it ever since. And indeed, I'm fucking proud, to use a word that might pass your lips, of that fact. 19 and a half years of which were spent working for Petróleos de Venezuela, which used to be a wonderful company until the dreaded Chavez got his hands on it. Anyhow, renewables are not a mass market product as such yet, and BP and other companies are moving away from them in recent years simply because the economics do not yet stack up. It's a bottom line issue, whether we like it or not. In the meantime, we have oil demand around the world growing enormously, 1 million barrels per day per year for at least the next 20 years. We have the Chinese taking to the roads, the Indians taking to the roads, the Chinese and the Indians burning coal like it's no tomorrow. There'll be some.
Are you celebrating this?
I'm not celebrating it. It's the facts of life. And they will continue burning fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. In the meantime, companies like BP, and Chevron and Exxon and Shell will continue looking for hydrocarbons around the world. Now, at the very beginning of the evening, it was mentioned that BP are looking in deep, deep waters because they've got nowhere else to go. But it's not true that there is nowhere else to find and produce oil, which we're going to continue to do for at least 20 more years. Why is that? Because the countries of the Middle East, for reasons of their own, and they're entitled to make these decisions, do not allow international oil companies to come in. There is no free market in oil and gas production, unfortunately. So perhaps Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Venezuela, Mexico, Russia, other countries around the world which are still sitting on enormous resources, many of which are actually producible at far, far less risk. This is the geopolitical challenge we need to face, that the oil consumers and the oil producers need to talk to each other to bring the technical know-how of the oil companies and their money together with the resources around the world to produce oil and gas for the next 20 years in a less risky way, so we have fewer opportunities to despoil the Gulf of Mexico. In the meantime, research goes on into renewables, of course, and gradually we will move away from the traditional fossil fuel economy. There's a very famous saying attributed to the great Sheikh Yamani 30 years ago, that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. The oil age will not end because we run out of oil. The oil age will end eventually when alternatives become available at an economic cost,
Amen.
But not before.
Amen. Thank you for the preaching. Thank you.
Okay, right, Chris, is it as simple as that?
It's as simple as that. No, I don't think it's as simple as that, because what I think we're not recognising here is that the cheap, low-cost oil has in fact been very aggressively exploited. Yes, it is probably true that there are parts of the world that aren't perfectly explored, but it's pretty heftily explored. People tend to make lovely remarks like there's lots of Libya that hasn't been looked at. What they don't understand is that if you go back to the 1960s, the oil companies who were there would go out every weekend, fire off unofficial seismic, and so they actually gained a pretty good idea. So this idea there's vast empty quarters and bits that haven't really been looked at or explored is largely, but not entirely, mythological. So the world's been pretty well looked at, it's been pretty well exploited, which is why we're pushing at these sort of frontier resources, whether it's tar sands, whether it's deep water, whether it's in very hostile environments. So the cost is going up. The cost is going up fast. And you know, companies and users, it's all about cost. Now, at the moment, it is probably true that most of the alternatives aren't truly economic. But then you get into that very wide debate, which is difficult, but does need tackling, of all the indirect subsidies there are to the extractive industries, all the indirect subsidies there are to using it, and the actual blocks and constraints on new industries coming in. So there has been a pretty spectacular political failure, first of all, not to recognise the enormity of the change that's coming up, the way the whole globe is reorientating itself. If you talk about the geopolitics, I mean, the Middle East is overwhelmingly looking east now. You know, the Riyadh's full of Chinese and Indians. The whole Gulf region is more and more thinking of sending its stuff that away. You know, Africa has got China like a rash over almost everywhere. And you know, what are we doing? We're sort of retreating into our own little pool and going deeper and deeper and deeper. Well, that's technically clever, but it's not going to in any sense resolve the problem. We're just not facing up to it.
Ben, can I bring you, because I mean the real cost of oil, I suspect what you're saying is the real cost of oil includes the environmental damage, includes the subsidies, it includes the militarization of places like the Niger Delta, it includes perhaps Iraq and Iran and all the sort of. Are you saying that this is the what we're really paying for oil is something completely different?
Absolutely, I think that the true cost of oil is almost unquantifiable in that sense. But we can try our best to illustrate, obviously, the negative impacts. But I mean, just coming back to some of the points raised in relation to the economics of renewables, and this isn't an area which I have great expertise. But what I would say is, I mean, it strikes me that you might be right about the economics not stacking up in the short term. But obviously, if you take into account the long-term catastrophic impacts of climate change and all of these other various associated costs that come attached to fossil fuels, then I don't think there's any question about renewable energy being more economic, cleaner, more efficient, and more beneficial in terms of the wealth of humanity. But also, I mean, this whole discussion about political risk is fraught with tensions in a way, and I think that if we think about the situation of, let's say, Ebebu, which is a small village in the Niger Delta, right? In the 1970s, there was an oil spill there, a big one, and the company responsible was Shell. It's still not cleaned up. Over 40 years after that oil spill, it's still not cleaned up. And just the other week, actually, the Nigerian High Court, Federal High Court, ordered Shell to pay in excess of $100 million, which is a fantastic judgment, included an enormous amount of punitive damages as well. Now, that's something that the communities have to celebrate, but after 12 years of litigation. So if we're looking at the relationship between oil companies and society, for communities like those in the Niger Delta, and there are many, many communities in the Niger Delta, thousands which live beside big oil companies, where is the equity for those communities? Where is the environmental justice? We, as Western governments, as Western people who are largely responsible for climate change and for the consumption of energy and oil and gas and so on, we owe an ecological debt to developing countries, to communities impacted by oil production, which is almost unquantifiable. But we can begin to see some of that debt repaid through enforcing regulation, through getting court judgments, through getting litigation, through fighting the oil companies and trying to redistribute some of that wealth in a way which is much more equitable. And I think there has to be larger geopolitical efforts to redistribute some of this huge ecological debt which we owe.
And that's part of the climate change debate. Okay, another question. One at the back there, please.
Ben, was it yourself that was in Resonance FM last week? Or was it one of your colleagues? You were on about the Tate and about sponsorship and about all BP and all that sort of thing.
Probably a colleague, but I can speak to
it.
Anyway,
well, whoever it was a really great piece of radio. I was just wondering, as an art activist, who are your main influences? Who are the people that float your boat, and who do you think is doing really interesting work in the art activism field?
Well, I think that I could probably list quite a few, but in general, I think the activists in the Niger Delta, for instance, who are very much continuing the legacy, and legacy is an important word, although we don't often talk about it, continuing the legacy of the Ogoni struggle, with the Ogoni being the minority in the Niger Delta who essentially took on the combined strength of Shell, Chevron, other companies, and the Nigerian military government. They protested. They launched some of the largest protests ever seen against an oil company in the world. 300,000 people came out to protest non-violently. to demand that the spills were cleaned up, to demand that they were compensated for the loss of livelihood, for the impact on human rights, and for the militarization and human rights abuses that occurred there. There are still activists there who are using non-violent means to monitor human rights, to advocate for more environmental protection, and to hold companies accountable. And this is a huge issue, I think, you know, the sort of lack of accountability for oil companies, whether they be, you know, private Western majors or national oil companies. There has to be strong mechanisms driven by activism on all levels to hold them accountable when they do act above the law. So there are many, you know, small pockets of activism around the Niger Delta which you won't hear about, because what you hear about is, you know, or what we have heard about for the last decade is essentially the militants whose actions are headline grabbing because, you know, when they attack or blow up a pipeline, the price of oil goes up on the international markets because of the way in which Nigerian crude is linked to the international markets. But, you know, beneath all of that, there are, you know, hard-working, dedicated activists on the ground, continuing the legacy of the Ogoni people, struggling for more justice and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Okay, next question. Anyone? Okay, one here or one there. Okay.
Chris, I was just wondering which number you thought we'd see first, 90 or 80 million barrels a day.
We'll see 90.
You see 90?
Yeah.
Sorry, explain the significance of that, will you?
Right.
We've been about 85 flat.
Yeah.
85 million.
85 million, but for flat for 5 years?
Yeah.
5 years.
well,
We're used to 2% a year increase, and we haven't seen that, and I'm wondering if that's a consequence of us actually hitting a real production plateau, or if it's political or somewhat a function of this current recession, which I frankly doubt, the last one.
Well, we have an installed capacity which is probably about 89 at the moment, and there's bits of stuff to come through. So yes, you're losing capacity to depletion all the time.
We're losing that for a year, right?
Yeah. So it's, yeah, we're not going forward very fast, but we have, because of the recession, we've got that OPEC spare capacity which is sitting there. Now, that is eroding, that isn't necessarily all real, but I still think we'll just about make 90, and then it will fade off.
Mm-hmm. Okay, question just actually at the front here, please.
Just go back to the point you mentioned previously. I think we heard a lot about, you know, sort of the importance of sort of the change in the awareness, you know, sort of incentive in using alternative solutions rather than oil. But you also mentioned that not, you know, sort of the oil company, you know, what happened in Niger Delta, they actually didn't spend any effort in cleaning up the mess they've made. So I'm kind of thinking the lack of incentive in cleaning up the damage they made is kind of about the same level as the lack of incentive in actually seeking the alternative solution. So how do you think, you know, I know it's important to seek sort of alternative solution, but how do you think that would change? I mean, you know, sort of what sort of financial incentive would give it to the company or to give it to the corporation themselves to actually make the changes?
Well, I think that, you know, in a sort of blunt, you know, short-term realpolitik way, you know, there is no financial incentive for the company to necessarily, you know, clean up a huge spill, which it has been allowed to sort of ignore for decades. And, you know, that's part of the problem, really. That's part of why we see, you know, thousands of oil spills being unaddressed in the Niger Delta, which are just sort of compounding the problem year after year. It's why also we see gas flaring in the Niger Delta, where companies burn off the gas associated with the oil that comes out of the ground, because they can get away with it, and because it's expensive for them to actually invest in the environmental protection, to invest in the solutions. But, you know, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't push them, because, as I was sort of saying earlier, I would argue for a much more longer-term vision of, when it comes to profits, when it comes to benefits to society as a whole. Because, obviously, if you present an argument which is based on a reduction in short-term profits, that's not going to be attractive to the board. But, if you're actually being more creative about the solution and arguing for a longer-term picture, I mean, for instance, take gas flaring in the Delta. Were the oil companies producing oil in Nigeria to actually tackle gas flaring seriously? And we're only beginning to see very sort of slow, creeping efforts to address the problem right now. Were they to actually solve gas flaring and to provide electricity, for instance, out of the gas that they're currently wasting? They burn off approximately $2.5 billion of gas every year. This is energy that's just disappearing and being wasted and turned into carbon emissions. If they use that to supply electricity to impoverished villages, which are currently, basically shut down as soon as the sun goes down and people are reading by candlelight, if they address that issue, then that would I believe that would have an urgent impact on people's propensity to resist oil production. And I think you'd find a lot less people turning to armed resistance if you saw companies taking the longer term vision and actually investing in the communities that they're working in. Because at the moment in Nigeria, certainly, they're allowed to just get away with atrocities against the environment and human rights.
Okay, I'm told that we've got to come to the end. We can continue in the bar or wherever. I'm just going to ask each of our, whoever's left, just to sum up in their own way and just leave us with a few thoughts to finish off with. So, Simon, tell us.
Is this a disaster? I guess it's a disaster in many ways. There are three golden rules of oil spills. I guess the biggest golden rule is don't spill it in the first place, and that's obviously not happened here. The second golden rule of an oil spill is you pick up as much as you can, as quickly as you can. And I guess BP in this case are doing the best they can. I guess in Nigeria they're not so bothered. The third golden rule is actually to do nothing, because in the ocean at least, and I emphasise this in the ocean, in the open ocean, Hayward was criticised, rightly or wrongly, for saying this was a drop in the ocean. We were sitting off the coast of Falmouth last week doing some work, and there were three tankers coming in, three supertankers coming into the channel. And those three tankers represent the total volume of oil spilt so far in the Gulf of Mexico. When you think of them in terms of the large numbers, the telephone numbers that people use, then it sounds terrible. The point is that a ton of oil spilt in a nature reserve is far worse than, say, 100 tons spilt on a beach, which is far worse than 100,000 tons spilt in the middle of the ocean. The ocean disperses it, it does break down through biological action eventually. And when you actually look at these three tankers, close to, they're huge. As you start to look at them in perspective in the channel, they are minute. And if you look at them in perspective of the Atlantic, they are insignificant. I think the issues that we're looking at probably isn't so much as what's the environmental damage of this spill, but it's possibly what's the political damage and what's the human damage that we're getting from oil. And in many ways, that's something we need to tackle just as readily as the environmental damage we're seeing from oil spills.
Chris, come in.
Right, well, we've been slightly gloomy. It's not really my intention. In fact, we're at one of those cusps in society where things are going to change and change very considerably. And once we're on the far side of the change, we'll wonder why we were quite so uptight about it. Because I think we will succeed in doing things differently. And I think this spill will end up being totemic. It'll be totemic because it was the company's race to the deep which failed, and we are now going to see real challenges to the companies in terms of their futures, because what they've been doing is probably a blind alley. They probably can't pull this off. So they will alter, they will mutate, they will start doing things differently, just as we'll have to start doing. So when you're in the middle of a sort of sort of turmoily bit of history. It just seems sort of nervous and slightly unpleasant. But I'm sure if we could transport ourselves 20 years forward and look back on this, we would see this as a quite key point, as the point probably when the Americans really start tackling the idea of their energy supplies, when the companies sort of realise they can't go on with quite the way they've been doing things and they've got to do things differently. And the point when we start saying that, you know, this oil business is becoming just too expensive, I can go out and buy an electric motorbike which will cost me a penny a mile to drive. In a minute I'm going to be able to drive a car that will cost me very few pence a mile and will be quiet and pleasant and the rest of it. So the salvation in some sense is in our hands. We're lucky because we still do live in the prosperous or the most prosperous part of the world. We may not feel it at the moment. So I think I'm optimistic.
Ben, do you share any of that?
Well, my thoughts come from a slightly different track, but I mean, essentially, I think that that we will continue to see the oil industry going as far and deep as it possibly can in order to find oil, and you know, I mean, it's just borne out by many examples. You know, Shell has been pushing very hard to drill in the Chukchi Sea off the coast of Alaska. And it's recently encountered sort of the political barrier of the moratorium, which has sort of slowed that down. But they're still very keen to drill, and essentially that means that, you know, we'll not only be seeing companies which, you know, we're all associated with and invested in the sense that that I outlined before. We'll see them drilling in deep water, but we'll also see them drilling in the Arctic as well, if they get their way. And of course, you know, one doesn't have to sort of labour the point that the risks of a deep water spill in an Arctic environment could be even more catastrophic, well, no doubt more catastrophic than in the Gulf of Mexico in terms of actually getting there to clean up or to try and mitigate the spill. So I mean, there's an inherent risk really to all of this drilling, and it's not just deep water. I mean, the industry tends to sort of categorize its different sort of fairly arbitrarily categorizing different modes of drilling, but you know, drilling anywhere in the water has an inherent risk, and if you have an oil spill anywhere in the water, it's going to spread and it's going to cause a lot of damage. And I think that what governments and civil society has had to wake up to and confront is the fact that a Deepwater Horizon could have happened anywhere. It could have happened in the North Sea. It could have happened off the coast of West Africa. And in fact, in previous years, there have been huge offshore oil spills in Nigeria, for instance. And no doubt there will continue to be so long as this inherent risk is passed on to the environment and society rather than actually accounted for within the companies and the corporate structure itself. And you know, we have to push for change because the industry won't change by itself, as I've said before. You know, if you look at Nigeria, there are many examples to illustrate this. So for instance, you know, the community of Ebebu, which I've mentioned already, with this favourable judgment of 100 million in terms of punitive damages against Shell, and also in terms of the damage caused by Shell's oil spill. Well, Shell is fighting that. It's going to take it to appeal. It's going to take it as high as it can go in the Nigerian courts, which could protract the litigation process for many, many years. And it, you know, no doubt, looking at its previous record in Nigeria, it hasn't always respected or even acknowledged court orders. They were ordered to stop gas flaring in the community of Iwerikan, and they ignored it. And that still continues today. So if these companies believe, so long as they believe that they're above the law, then essentially, you know, they will continue to entrench the status quo. And until we launch activism on all levels, be it within government or outside of it, I don't think we're going to see a substantial change in the behavior of these companies.
Well, there we go. I don't know what to say. We've, you know, we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much for being a great audience. Good questions. Thank you very much to our panel, Simon, Chris, Ben. Tremendous stuff, very stuff which I've never heard before. And may we, I don't know what to say, but maybe we go and have a drink and talk about it. Thank you very much indeed.